month before the US election, the Washington Post ran an opinion piece with the subheading, "Anxiety levels in Europe over the US election are very high." In it, the author tried to give an international perspective on the then looming clash between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, one peppered with quotes like this: "What has struck me most during several visits to Europe this year is the anguish that a potential second Trump presidency is causing among our staunchest friends." Now, the author wasn't alone in this. The Guardian, The Economist, Bloomberg, and more all ran articles in the run-up to the election, fretting about the damage a Trump victory would cause to the old continent. Articles that were full of phrases like Trump-proofing Europe that talked about the anxieties of everyone from Danes to Poles over a return of the 45th president. Now, if you're an American, such fretting might seem natural. After all, whichever side you're on, you've just gone through the stress of an election that seemed freakishly close until the last moment. But for a European like me, or like some of the writers and editors on this channel, these articles were not natural, or at least they shouldn't have been. Because the fact is that an entire continent having a collective anxiety attack about a foreign election is kind of insane. As is the idea that the fate of Europe lay in the hands of swing state voters pissed off about Joe Biden's track record. After all, Europe's rich. Well, it's not as rich as America, but it's richer than almost anywhere else. It's big. There's nearly 450 million citizens. It has world-class universities, a well-educated workforce, and is home to companies like ASML that are vital to the semiconductor industry. In short, Europe should be an independent power. In a sane world, its people should find US elections important, but in the same way that we find elections in, say, India important. These are things that are worth paying attention to, but they're not going to affect our daily lives. But we don't live in a sane world. In the world we live in, European leaders, and by this I mean not just the EU, but also the UK and the wider European Economic Area, are scrambling to figure out what comes next, asking what a Trump victory means for their own security, as well as for the fate of Ukraine, a European nation that borders multiple EU countries. And frankly, this is absurd. The idea that someone like me, sat here in Prague, can feel less safe because of voters in rural Michigan is ridiculous. And things are only this way for a single reason. For nearly 2 decades after the financial crisis, countless European leaders made the staggeringly irresponsible decision to outsource our security to the United States. At the same time, they gambled that the autocrat sat in the Kremlin was a sane guy that they could do business with. The sort of guy who would never, start a massive off land war. Such hopes were always naive. After the annexation of Crimea, they became actively dangerous. But it was really with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022 that it became obvious the current situation was untenable. Somewhere out there are multiple parallel universes in which the jolt of war shocked Europe's big players into action, in which much of the continent moved onto an emergency war economy as soon as it became clear that the fighting wasn't going to be over in 3 days. In those universes, Trump's return to the White House has Europe concerned, but also relieved that powerful nations like Germany led the way in rearming 2 years ago, relieved that with defense production ramping up, we're already churning out more shells and armored vehicles than Russia. Sadly, none of that happened in our universe. In our universe, leaders of major European countries were content to roll the dice again, this time on the idea that America would re-elect Joe Biden, a man older than the sun, or else elect Kamala Harris, the vice president of an unpopular administration. So, you can imagine the panic now setting in, the same panic that a deadbeat must feel when they finally get kicked off their friend's couch. The cold knowledge that they'll now need to either stand on their own 2 feet or get busy dying. Now, we should point out here that it's not certain Trump Mark II will drag the US out of NATO and encourage Vladimir Putin to do whatever the hell he wants with Eastern Europe. We're making this video only a few days after the election, and things are still definitely in flux. It could be that Trump surprises us all by flooding Ukraine with weapons and giving Europe's leaders special gold stars for being really good boys and girls. But since it was crossing their fingers and hoping America would be nice that got our leaders into this mess, to do so again would be madness. That's why the rest of this video is going to be our reflections on what this great continent, my home, needs to do next. A grab bag of thoughts about what the election outcome does and doesn't mean for the future of Europe. Now look, unlike most of our videos, we're going to engage in a lot of editorializing today, but we're going to be doing it from a position of what we hope is some knowledge, and also out of our desire to see our home finally stop relying on America and stand on its own damn feet. So look, Apologies if this isn't our usual fare, but this is rather personal for me and many members of our team. Rest assured, we'll be back to our regular, measured presentation in the next video. Now look, the first thing to note is that miraculously, it's still not too late for Europe to do something about this. Don't get me wrong here, money needs to be pouring into ramping up defense production the day before yesterday, but we're not quite at the point of catastrophe. And the reason for that is that the predator next door has already broken its claws trying to devour Ukraine. The Kremlin's army has sustained eye-watering casualties since 2022, perhaps as many as 600,000 killed and wounded. Elite units have been wiped out. The open-source intelligence group Oryx lists over 3,500 tanks and over 10,000 armored combat vehicles lost. Expensive fighter jets have been downed. Command and control aircraft destroyed. Warships forcibly upgraded to submarines. Now, what we're trying to say is that this is not a military ready to launch a direct attack on NATO in the near future. The actual horizon for such readiness is debatable, and estimates stretch from an uncomfortable 5 to 8 years to a hair-raising 2 to 3 years. But the point is that even if Ukraine were to capitulate tomorrow, Putin would need time to reconstitute his battered military to a state where it could fight even a version of Ukraine that lacks the US. And that time frame is therefore how long Europe has to get strong enough to deter an attack. The good news is that with enough urgency and with enough investment, this should absolutely be doable. Europe is already home to world-class defense companies like Rheinmetall, Saab, and Thales. It boasts some of the world's better militaries. France is one of the few countries capable of conducting out-of-area operations, while the UK, despite ill-judged cuts, still retains a decent Tier 2 military. Slightly further down the scale, Finland maintains a large standing army and huge artillery capabilities, while Poland is rearming at a jaw-dropping scale. Even tiny Sweden has an excellent reputation for high-tech equipment and electronic warfare. Look, what we're trying to say is that the expertise is already there. It's just the investment and the political will that's lacking. Now, that's not to say that a Europe that spends heavy on defense will ever be equal to the US, nor will it be able to paper over the America-sized hole in NATO. There are certain capabilities that the US has, like heavy lift and reconnaissance, that just can't be easily replicated. However, the end goal isn't a Europe that could win a war against America or China. It's a Europe that could win a war against its only serious regional enemy, Russia. On paper, this should be easy. Russia is not the Soviet Union, and many of the Warsaw Pact's more formidable nations are now in NATO. Just compared the populations and economies. Russia's home to nearly 150 million people versus over 500 million in the combined EU and UK. In 2024, the IMF estimates that the EU is the world's second largest economy, with the UK ranking 7th. Russia, meanwhile, limps in at 12th. Show these comparisons to someone shorn of all context, and they would assume that Russia was a middle power beside a behemoth, a country that would surely be terrified of ever crossing Europe's red lines. That things in real life are the other way around just goes to show how utterly pathetic our leaders have been in the last few years. Nor can they hide behind the excuse that Russia is the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Both Britain and France maintain enough nukes to reduce Putin's empire to ashes, with the French nuclear deterrent having the added bonus that it's not reliant on American technology. Of course, the reality is that Europe is far less united than its size and economic clout would suggest. There are serious questions over whether Paris would be willing to go to war for, say, Estonia, and some nations have openly pro-Russian leaders. Leaders who, through the vagaries of the EU and NATO systems, wield vetoes. But it's worth remembering that these leaders are so far only found in tiny countries like Hungary and Slovakia. Nor do their natural bedfellows necessarily share their views on Moscow. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni has proven herself to be part of the European mainstream on security issues, frequently speaking in support of Ukraine. In Poland, the right-wing Law and Justice Party, aligned with President Duda, is, if anything, more hawkish on Russia than the current government. And while Marine Le Pen is a worry in France, Macron's term as president does not expire until spring of 2027, hopefully enough time to tie Paris into some new defense contracts. And so we come back to the basic theme of this video. There is nothing to stop Europe from becoming a military power capable of slapping Putin down. The problem is that it is easier said than done. As Economist defense editor Shashank Joshi tweeted regarding these sorts of tasks, quote, "None of this helps. All echoes of 2016. What we need now is specifics. What to do and spend on. Priorities. What to do and spend on first. And numbers. What it costs." Now, since we don't set budgets or work in procurement, we can't be as specific as I'd like. But what we can do now is offer some very basic outlines of a plan for making Europe self-sufficient, for turning what is, in effect, a continent-sized cowardly lion into an apex predator. The first thing to sort out is leadership. No more waiting around for Germany to assume the mantle of leader. It's not going to happen. What countries terrified of Russia need to do is fall behind a capital that is actually competent and serious about defense. This could be Paris. It could be London, which needs to get over its own post-Brexit aversion of any mention of Europe. Or it could be Warsaw, a capital that spends over 4% of its GDP on defense and seems happy to take up the role. Following Trump's re-election, Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski declared that, quote, Europe urgently needs to take more responsibility for its security. Poland's leadership will rise to the occasion. Now, the advantage of Warsaw taking the lead is that no one in Eastern Europe doubts that the Poles would go to war to protect the Baltic states or Finland, things that aren't so clear-cut where France is concerned. In fact, if the Trump administration wants Europe to stand on its own, it could do worse than making Poland the new center of gravity for NATO. Speaking of Poland, it remains one of the few nations in NATO to spend an amount on defense that is equal to the threat it faces. Now look, I'll be honest, it's pretty tiring for us Europeans to hear Americans claim we don't hit NATO's 2% spending target when most nations this year did exactly that, with some notable exceptions, Belgium. But it's also true that 2% is no longer going to cut it. Here's how former British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace put it. So whatever your feelings about the US election are, the best insurance for all our security is to invest in our own defense and security right across Europe. We don't need ridiculous European armies or a EU defense rival to NATO. We need to all invest 3% GDP across the alliance. Analyst Colby Badwa was even blunter, quote, 2% of GDP wasn't good enough yesterday, and it certainly isn't good enough today. Every member of NATO needs to have a detailed and credible plan to reach 3% over the next 4 years. Now, 3% across the board is a huge financial commitment, but it's also not an impossible one to hit, and it doesn't necessarily require deep cuts to other services. Italy, for example, is pushing the EU to issue so-called Eurobonds, or joint debt, to finance a defense spending splurge. Similar debt was issued amid the emergency of the pandemic, so it's not impossible to do so again, despite opposition from Germany. There are also ways to spend that money better than happens at the moment. Shashank Joshi favors, quote, creative solutions such as buying US arms and finding collaborative ways to scale up production at lower cost. There are also other suppliers out there that Europe could partner with. South Korea turns out world-class defense kit at a much lower cost than most other places, and already has contracts inked with European nations such as Poland that include technology transfers. Or hey, investments could be made at home. Rheinmetall has already expanded shell production from 70,000 per year before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine to 700,000 this year. Big long-term contracts could let companies invest in new factories and open yet more production lines, a big deal when Russia's shell production seems to have plateaued. Domestic industry could also benefit from lawmakers waiving all the usual red tape. One reason Europe didn't freeze in late 2022 after Putin shut off gas flows was because panicked governments forced through the construction of new liquefied natural gas terminals at warp speed. In Germany, typical construction time went down from 3 years to a mere 10 months. Remember when that bridge collapsed in Pennsylvania in 2023? Remember how everyone said it would take roughly 3 geological ages to fix it, only for the governor to pull out at all the stops and get the thing back up and running in like 2 weeks? Well, that's exactly what Europe needs to do with its defense production. Except that this is a 5-alarm fire, suspend normal processes and just get the damn thing done as soon as possible. Part of that's going to involve cutting through the bureaucracy and self-interest that the EU is famous for. Writing on X, political scientist Marcel Dursers half-joked that, quote, I can't take another 4 years of policy papers, op-eds, and panel discussions about European strategic autonomy. I'm begging European governments to just buy tanks, add assembly lines, build factories, order ammunition, get more drones, fly more planes, make sure ships can sail. End quote. This should apply across the board. After all, even nations that are physically far away from Russia, such as Portugal, can't guarantee they wouldn't be dragged into a European war. As such, all countries should think about not just boosting defense spending, but also start seriously considering things like conscription or national service. These are just the basic outlines of what needs to happen. The obvious ideas that European nations should have started working on by March 2022 at the latest. We're sure defense industry experts can and will add many other ideas as Trump's inauguration approaches. To end this video though, we'd just like to turn back again to the country that my continent allowed itself to get too overdependent on. the United States. Since the early 2010s, Washington has been trying to push Europe to get more serious about defense. This is something we on this channel have been supportive of for the very simple reason that we don't want our next YouTube venture to be video tours of our gulag. But we should be clear that if by some miracle Europe manages to collectively get its shit together after Trump's victory, the US may need to be careful what it wishes for. A Europe that's capable of standing on its own 2 feet will likely do exactly that, making its own stances on the global stage, rather than just following America. On the plus side, this will mean Washington can turn its full attention to Asia. But it will also mean countries like the UK, France, and Italy, which today send warships through the Taiwan Strait, will likely not be able to help the US much in its confrontation with China. It may even mean a Europe that eventually winds up like India, an American ally that nonetheless sometimes acts against Washington's key interests. Still, while such an outcome might be annoying for the Pentagon, the fact is that both the US and Europe would benefit from a world where they could stand as near equals. It's a scary thought for our leaders over here, used as many of them are to a post-World War II order where America is the center of the universe. But fears are there to be faced. At the end of all of that, then, we're back where we started, aren't we? With a continent that needs to get a grip, not tomorrow, not later today, right now. This very second. Because thanks to the sacrifice of countless Ukrainians, we still have the tiniest window of opportunity to get our shit together, to all do what Poland and the Baltic states have done, and hike defense spending into the stratosphere. Because if European leaders fumble this, the consequences are not going to be limited to Trump trolling them on X. Instead, they'll be in the form of broken buildings and burned out streets, or artillery booming over European cities, and to return to our continent's darkest chapters. So look, if you're a viewer with any position of power in the UK or the EU, be it in politics or defense circles, look, we'll beg you, get started now. Do whatever you personally can to get things moving. Or else, prepare for a world in which a country a fraction of the economic size and manpower of the EU gets to dismember our continent and decide our fates at the barrel of a gun. And if that moment ever comes, don't say that nobody warned you. This is your warning. This is me, fellow European, telling you what needs to be done. The rest is up to you, isn't it? Thanks for watching.